Hello and welcome to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today is Friday, May 11th, and we're also pleased to have with us in the studio, returning again, two veteran journalists to talk about some recent headline stories and speculate about where some of that is all going. We're pleased to welcome back to the studio today Howard Weiss-Tisman, who is the Southern Vermont reporter for Vermont Public Radio, I should say Southern Vermont and Upper Valley reporter for Vermont Public Radio, and also Derek Carson, who is a reporter for the Bennington Banner and the Manchester Journal. Gentlemen, welcome back, and thank you for making the time available.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, the last time we were here, a couple of months ago, education issues were kind of at the forefront and topped our agenda, and it looks like we're going to at least start off that way again today. Coming up not too far from now, in a couple of weeks, on June 1st to be precise, the Education Agency is going to submit its so-called map, where all the school districts around the state will be reconfigured into under Act 46, the Education Consolidation Statute that passed in 2015. A lot of school districts have been already consolidated into new configurations, but there are still a few outliers out there, both in Bennington and Windham counties. So, Derek, get us started here. I mean, one of them is Arlington, our neighbor just to the south here. They have asked for an extension, I guess, from the Education Agency.
In a sense, sure. Arlington is in a fairly unique situation. They're the only operating pre-K through 12 district in this part of the state. Of course, the SVSU south of them, the Mount Anthony district, is 6 through 12, and then there's a bunch of elementary school districts under there. That's not really the same structure. Up here in the BRSU, there's all kinds of structures, but no pre-K through 12. So they're in a very odd situation where they're not going to be able to have any easy partners. So they have expressed their desire to remain independent. Based on what they're hearing, they have no idea if that's going to happen or not. The whole push of this Act 46 is towards consolidation. They say if when this map comes out on June 1st, if you really want to put us with someone, please put us with the BRSU, and give us an additional 2 years to figure out how to make that transition. Under the law as it's written, they would have the new supervisory union would go, and the new districts would go into effect July 1st of next year, 2019. BRSU has said they're already working on all these other mergers, Taconic and Green, all of these things. Their staff is pushed to the limit as it is. If they were to handle incorporating Arlington into that whole structure as well, that would just be too much for them. They have asked that Arlington not be merged with them. The SVSU, from what we hear, feels the same way. They've got a lot of things going on. Incorporating Arlington by next July will be a difficult endeavor if the state were to push in that direction. So this extension, we have no idea what's going to come of that, what the state's going to say, but Arlington's hoping. They amended their Section 9 report to include, Sandgate did as well, to include this extension, this request for just give us 2 years. We're willing to, you have the authority to put us into a different supervisory union. The state's always had that authority. That isn't new under Act 46. But give us 2 years to figure out how to make that transition work. So that's where Arlington's at right now.
Is it complicated by the fact that it would be the only public high school within the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory
Exactly.
Union, which brings a whole new element into the equation. I'm sure over in Windham County we must have similar situations where there are still some school districts that are kind of not yet merged up with their dance partners.
Very similar. And to take a step back just a little bit, when Act 46 passed, the whole law was set up on a timeline, and there were different dates under which different actions were taken, when you could put in your consolidation plan, when you were able to get tax breaks, et cetera. And June 1st of 2018 has always been a very important date, because this is what everyone is waiting for, the statewide plan. And there are schools all over Bennington County, Windham County, all over the state that haven't merged. And over the past few months, they've made their pitch to the State Board of Education. And they've said, this is why we want to stay independent. This is why we don't want to merge. And on June 1st, we're going to find out whether they were successful in pitching that plan. Now, it's also important to point out that this is not the complete deadline. The plan is a draft, and once this comes out over the next 3 to 6 months, school boards can continue to make their case with the State Board. The State Board of Education has said that they're going to hold 3 regional meetings over the summer in the northern, central, and southern parts of the state. And then there's, of course, State Board of Education meetings every month. And so once this plan comes out, we're going to find out which schools might be able to remain independent, which the state is saying, no, you can't be independent, you're going to merge. And there's going to be a lot of unhappy and happy people after that plan comes out, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the conversations ensue from there. That being said, in Windham County, in the Brattleboro area, all of the schools in that district are asking to remain independent, and just north in the Bellows Falls area as well, those schools did not merge. The schools around Wilmington and around Newfane have merged, so they're all set and they're moving along. Statewide, about 60% of the schools have consolidated. So a lot still haven't. So there's still a lot of conversations to be had, and a lot still remains to be seen how this all plays out.
And you wrote about one interesting situation. I'm not sure if it's completely unique to the state yet or not, but with the town of Stamford and Clarksburg, Massachusetts, seeking to kind of do a union.
Yeah, that is a
sorts.
whole other interesting issue. And Stamford was out. The rest of that district merged. Those were the schools around Halifax, and I'm blanking now the other schools in that area. But Stamford is only 4 miles from Clarksburg, Massachusetts. And so what Stamford is asking for an interstate agreement, and this would be the first interstate agreement with Massachusetts. There are some schools that have such agreements in New Hampshire,
Right.
Up along the Connecticut
Banner,
River.
I think, yeah.
There's a couple of those, but this would be the first in Massachusetts. It's pretty complicated, it's pretty unique. It actually requires an act of Congress to approve. Once the states approve it, the US Congress has to approve it. So it's pretty complicated. When the issue was first raised, there was little pushback in the state, and some people said it wasn't going to happen, but it does seem to be moving along now. Massachusetts invested $25,000. Stamford, Vermont is now trying to get a $25,000 grant as well, so they can look into the feasibility of forming this interstate compact. So that Stamford is a very small school down in the southern part of the state, so another interesting thing we're going to be watching.
Well, meanwhile, up in Montpelier, the legislature is trying to adjourn, I guess, not having an easy time of it for the second year in a row. There's some late end of session drama underway between the governor's office and the state legislature over funding for education, and last year was around the statewide teachers contract and health insurance issues. This year, the governor has put forward an idea that would use $58 million, I believe, or thereabouts, in one-time money to offset a otherwise needed property tax increase, which, as we know, the governor is kind of allergic to in a major way. Really wants to keep a budget with no new fees or taxes. But basically, this legislature once again is feeling like, okay, you're unveiling this plan, which has a lot of elements to it, changes to the way special education is being funded, creating a state teacher health care benefit, and interestingly, and I think probably one that will give us a lot to talk about down the road, is this whole changing of the student-staff ratio. It seems to be kind of a centerpiece of this. Currently, Vermont is the lowest state in the country when it comes to the number of students per teacher, at slightly over 5 teachers per student, and the governor would like to see that moved up to 5 3/4 students per teacher. Interesting to see how the 3/4 works out here. But anyway, what is our sense here of how realistic this is? I mean, the teachers union is kind of come out, not surprisingly, not in favor of that. I think I remember hearing something like 1,000 jobs that were involved here. So do we think that this idea has any traction going forward?
Well, this goes right back to what we were talking about with Act 46. And Vermont has a lot of small schools, and it's a very complicated, it's kind of easy to make a state map and to put an Excel spreadsheet together and talk about and joke about 5.25 or whatever. But what we have is a lot of small schools. And for some of these small schools, they're down winding mountain roads, and if they're going to close a small school, it means putting a second grader on a bus and having him or her drive a bus 40 minutes or an hour each way, and parents don't want to do that. So as you said, this comes up every session. It's really a challenge for the state, and there's not going to be any real way out of it. The legislature seems really opposed to these ratios, enforcing these ratios. The governor is digging in his heels on it, so I'm not sure how it's going to play out. But again, as we've said, this is the same challenge and debate that happens every single year right around this time.
And even before we get into the weeds with how plausible the student-staff ratios are, there were a lot of other issues with this, the education budget that the governor put out. The Joint Financial Office released a report earlier this week. They suggested that this $58 million one-time expense to close the gap and keep property taxes level this year, that could just lead to a $98 million gap next year, kicking the can down the road. Then they said in that report that he had double counted the benefits of a change in special education funding. That change is even going to take 5 or 6 years to implement. We won't see those savings necessarily next year. There's a lot of what they called funny math going on in there. We're talking about the student staff ratios. It is true that student population in Vermont has declined over the last 10, 15 years. Staff population has remained, staff population, but the staff numbers have remained steady. Right. There's a lot that goes into that, however. The laws regarding special education have changed. The IEPs, the individual education plans, are now created at the beginning of a student's educational career. That's done in a combination with the special education department at the school, the principal, the student's doctor, the student's parents. They all get together, they create this individual education plan for special ed students. If that plan requires a one-to-one paraeducator, the school is required by law to give that student a one-to-one paraeducator. That's inflating staff numbers as special education numbers rise throughout the state. I can say in the SVSU, they have been using in all their schools now for several years what they call a multi-tiered system of support, a 3-tiered education model where you have the classroom education, then interventionists who work with students who are struggling. Those interventionists are funded by title funds often, but sometimes they're in the school's budget. But that's raising the number of staff at the school, but they're doing good and important educational work, especially for the lowest income students. So to just say we can cut staff through attrition, through retirements, it's a little more complicated than that.
And one issue that I wrote a story a couple of years ago that figures into this is that Vermont has the highest percentage of kids receiving special ed for emotional disturbance by a long shot. And when you look at the numbers, it's really interesting. People who are in the special ed community say that's because Vermont is servicing kids as they need to be serviced, and we're doing a better job of identifying it. That's a whole different debate. But the fact of the matter is that these student-to-staff ratios, sure, we have fewer kids, and that means that if there used to be 20 kids in a second grade and now there's 15, that's going to skew it. But also, there are a lot more counselors in the school now. There are a lot more therapists in the school now. And that's something that's adding to this ratio. And that's a whole other thing that could be looked at and should be looked at.
I mean, one of the things that I guess I've thought for a while is that the only way we're ever going to see real savings in the education budget is by closing some of the smaller schools that you could argue are less efficient than larger schools, and at least in terms of the teacher-student ratio. But that clearly is like a third rail in Vermont politics, isn't it? I mean, the outcry whenever a school looks like it's going to be had to, close the stores so that because it just doesn't make sense to run it anymore. It always is, kind of a very difficult time for the local town.
And another thing to
I
think
guess
about,
I just wonder, how we're ever going to do that.
Right.
How are we ever going to get stabilized taxes?
Town meeting, the towns are approving these budgets. And at this past year, the governor asked schools to keep their budgets below 2%. Statewide, schools did that. And I think that 90 or 95% of the schools approved their budgets this year. So they're going to the local people saying, yes, we're going to approve this budget. We want to support our schools. And then it kind of sugars off up the top of Montpelier, and they try to control that. So it's, I don't have the answer.
Before we leave the whole education arena, I guess one last point we should maybe just touch upon is in the midst of all of this, we have an interim education secretary, Rebecca Holcomb, who had been education secretary for the past few years, originally appointed by Governor Peter Shumlin, left that post in early April. Any sense as to when a replacement is going to be named or found, or how is that process going?
So very quickly, a search committee was set up by the State Board of Education. The State Board search committee interviewed 7 candidates this week. The State Board of Education has their monthly meeting next month, and the search committee is going to present up to 7 candidate names for the State Board to approve. The State Board approves it and then hands a list over to the governor, and the governor decides who he wants as the next Secretary of Education. Now, if you remember when Rebecca Holcomb first resigned, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle where the governor said it wasn't important that the person have a good education background. It's more important to have a business background, and the State Board pushed back on that. They actually pointed out that it's in statute that the State Secretary of Education needs to have an education background. So it will be very interesting to see the names that the State Board hands over to the governor, and if the governor is not happy with those, he can send the process back to 0 and start over again. So it'll be interesting to see who the candidates are and if the governor is happy with who they're presenting, and see what happens after that.
And as you say, it'll definitely be an interesting story to follow with all of the emphasis the governor is placing on making schools more efficient, cutting down those budgets. If he's pushing back against having an educator in that role as well, what I'm hearing from teachers is that they don't want to see a situation like we're seeing on the national level with Betsy DeVos as education secretary. Something like that could be really damaging for the level of education being put out in Vermont schools. So that's going to be a tough line to walk for the governor. So I'm excited. I'm anticipating what is going to be happening.
Figures out, yeah.
Well, amazing timing with everything else going on on the education front. But meanwhile, there are a few other things going on around the state that don't involve education, I think. One of them is the PFOA situation kind of is back in a way. Derek, apparently the chemical contaminant that was found in several wells in North Bennington and Pownell and a few other areas a couple of years ago returned to the headlines.
And that really is the, even more so than education spending, the never-ending story, at least in southern Bennington County. We had several different stories regarding it in the past week. Of course, Senator Campion and Sears have been pushing their legislation to hold companies more accountable in Vermont at these sites. So that was vetoed by the governor. The Senate was pushing a new version of that bill, again with everything that's going on in the legislature right now and the end of the legislative session coming up. Not sure exactly what the status on that's going to be, but that's something they've been pushing pretty hard. We also had, with the water lines being installed, that sort of paused over the winter, of course, that's picked up again. What to do with the displaced dirt as those water lines are extended in North Bennington to houses that the wells were affected by PFOA. Now neighbors where that dirt is being placed are saying that when it rains, that is leaching into their property, contaminating their wells. So that's going to be a story to follow moving forward. And there is a meeting coming up next week, I believe.
Monday.
On Monday.
Ministry of Natural Resources is coming. They're holding 2 meetings, I think, for the east and west parts.
Right.
And while the water line extension is ongoing in the west part,
Yes.
is that correct?
Yep.
The eastern part of Bennington is still waiting for a resolution, and there's a dispute between St. Cobain and the state over who's responsible for the PFOA contamination in the eastern part. So water line extensions have not started yet. I think that the legislature put some money in to begin engineering studies there. But as you know, the construction season goes by very quickly here. It's probably not going to happen this year, but you never know. But that's something to watch. One other, on the legislative front, the bill to hold companies responsible for medical bills passed, correct?
Yes, I believe that was
another-
earlier this week.
Right,
yes.
that was another PFOA connected bill saying that if people have medical bills down the road or whatnot, that the companies who are responsible for the contamination will have to pay. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the courts. But that's another thing, so yeah.
And the governor has spoken many times about not wanting to implement any of these laws that might scare businesses away from Vermont. So it's interesting to see how that will play into that.
That was why he vetoed the first
first bill,
iteration
yes.
of the Sears-Campion bill on that one.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen to this one. He hasn't
Right.
signed this one yet.
Exactly.
So we'll see if the governor supports that.
All right, well, to be continued then. Howard, you had an interesting story a couple of weeks ago, I believe, on Airbnb and a registry program. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so these are the final days of the session, as you said, and this bill...
Everything's happening.
Everything is happening, and as of this morning, this was kind of bouncing back and forth between the Senate and the House, and this is a bill that has really been pushed by the hotel industry, and the hotels and inns are kind of saying that the Airbnb hosts are not playing by the same rules, that if you open up an Airbnb, you don't have to meet the same health and safety codes, you don't have to meet the same fire codes. So the hotel and inn industry is just trying to say, put things on the same playing field. And so if this bill moves ahead as it's written, it would be the first state in the country to set up a statewide registry. And so if you open up an Airbnb, you have to register with the state. And what lawmakers are hoping that leads to is that health and safety will kind of give you a packet. So you know about fire codes, and you know about clean water, and you know about safety and accessibility and that kind of thing. So it's looking like it's going to pass. As I said, it's been bouncing back and forth. The most recent thing I saw is that there was some debate about what the Airbnb hosts are going to have to post in their house, believe it or not. That's what they're fighting over now. And I think the House, I believe, made this last-ditch idea that if you open an Airbnb apartment, that you need to kind of post emergency exits and that kind of thing. And that's what they're talking about now. So we'll see. Airbnb I've been in contact with, and I have to say it's not just Airbnb, they're calling this short-term rentals, and there are other companies that do this, so, but Airbnb is the most well-known one. And Airbnb has had lobbyists in the State House and on the phone, and they're not opposing it. They're saying that health and safety is good. Of course, Vermont passed a tax law a couple of years ago, so Airbnb hosts pay their room and meal taxes now. Vermont is one of the few states that do that as well. So, so we'll see what happens. It's an interesting bill.
I remember when that came up for discussion. I know it was a real source of concern for a lot of the traditional lodging owners, motels, bed and breakfast type places that did have to pay those taxes. And if you were renting out your bedroom or an extra room in your house, you could sort of slide around that one.
And one last thing I'll say, the numbers are astounding on the number of Airbnb. I mean, obviously Vermont has a tourist economy, and the numbers, the rise in the number of Airbnb, it's I don't have it at my disposal, but it's just huge growth, the number of people that are. And the hotel industry is saying it's cutting into their numbers. It's really cutting into their numbers, so.
Yeah, well, that's not surprising to hear. I mean, sure seems like it's a very attractive option for a lot of folks.
And in Bennington, this is definitely something that they're aware of. We recently completed a charter review process that's going up for vote in June. And one of the specific things the committee wrote into their recommendations is that the select board have the ability to legislate new technologies and how the town deals with those. One of the examples they specifically brought up was Airbnb. I think there's a concern of people buying out vacant residential properties that the value has dropped on, then essentially running hotels that aren't hotels in those residential areas. We haven't seen a ton of that yet, but with housing prices dropping in Bennington, pretty large vacancy, that's something that could definitely happen around the corner.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting issue. In a lot of cities, there have been discussions about if this has taken affordable housing away, where it's the same kind of thing where people are buying up affordable housing, opening Airbnb, and there are fewer options for younger people who want to move in and stuff like that.
I believe Boston just passed a law relating to that.
Yeah, they're talking about it.
Right.
Mayor Walsh was just raised that, so yeah.
I'll take this chance to give a short plug for an interview show we're going to be taping next week, where we're going to have two folks here who are involved in the economic summit that's going to be held at Mount Snow on May 30th. Jonathan Cooper from the Bennington County Regional Commission and Sarah Lang from the Southern Vermont Economy Project, which is run under the auspices of the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. Two agencies that will be helping host that summit on Mount Snow, and we'll be talking about a lot of economic issues affecting both Bennington and Windham counties. Many of you may remember about 3 years ago, the Southern Vermont Economic Zone report came out, which showed the southern tier counties in Vermont struggling a bit, facing demographic challenges like much of the rest of the state is. And this will be an opportunity for I guess, further collaboration between agencies that are involved in economic growth in the state, and housing, I'm sure, will be one of those questions, because it seems to keep coming up all the time. So we'll stay tuned for that, and look forward to hearing what both Jonathan and Sarah have to tell us about what's going to be on the agenda. We have a couple of minutes left, and I just thought it'd be kind of interesting to bat around an inside the journalism beltway story that kind of came up a week or so ago, I guess, or maybe a couple of weeks ago. By coincidence, all of us used to work for Media News Group at various places. Media News Group was a large chain of newspapers that included the Banner, the Brattleboro Reformer, the Manchester Journal, Berkshire Eagle, several other papers. Right across the country, and some folks may have heard about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I guess, the editorial staff of the Denver Post, which is the flagship paper of Media News Group, staged a bit of a revolt and complained about the fact that staff layoffs and attrition were basically making it difficult for them to kind of do their jobs and put out a paper and a publication that they felt was representative of their community out in Denver. I know all of us struggled over the past 10 or so years with the same issues, where you saw staff being cut and jobs just being sort of, reconfigured, and of course a lot of that was driven by economic factors. But one of the thing that made the Media News Group thing in the Denver Post, and by extension Alden Capital Management, I think, is a hedge fund on Wall Street that owns Media News Group, has been aggressively driving at reducing staffs at newspapers to increase profits, and according to a report that came out, they have done their job well. Profits at their papers are very high, among the highest in the business, but it's come at the expense of reporters and photographers and editors and layout people across the board.
And there have been countless articles written and editorials written about their strategy, how they hope that as they cut staff, and of course the newspaper quality will decline. I mean, I believe in your last days at the Journal and during my time at the Banner before it was purchased by New England Newspapers Incorporated, we saw staff cut to maybe half of what it had been 5 years earlier in the newsroom. That's not sustainable. News quality is going to decrease. But there's a gap between as that quality goes down and when people unsubscribe. It takes a little bit of time. They milk as much money as possible out of that gap period before everyone unsubscribes from your newspaper. That's their strategy. And it's really disappointing because local newspapers in some communities are the only source of news for that community. You can have for 45 minutes away, we can watch the Albany TV stations or the Boston TV stations, but you're not getting that local news. So thankfully the Banner, the Journal, the Reformer, staff isn't Our new owners are investing. Staff is increasing again. We're still not up to the when I came on 5 years ago where we were in terms of staffing, but we're getting there, and we're still doing our best. So it's good to have gotten away from that before all of this came to a head. But we saw the signs of this happening 4 or 5 years ago.
I just thought it was amazing to see the Denver Post editorial staff, coming right out and saying, "Hey, we can't do the job we need to do with the number of people that we have left." And
I mean, I think all of us, and we as journalists, we take pride in our work and we take pride in the product we put out. When staff cuts get so bad that we aren't able to put out the product we want to, I'm not surprised that they revolted, and I would not be surprised to see more newspapers speak out in the future.
Yeah.
And there are so many interesting issues on this. Certainly, what's going on with Facebook and with fake news, and a lot of that whole discussion about the people who are posting to that. And I think when all of these discussions started 8 years ago, 10 years ago, it was all about the change in media landscape, and I think that continues to shift. There's more online. A lot of the newspapers are embracing that and changing their platform and making sure they're staying current. And also important to put out, this is not just a local Vermont story. This is, as you said, Denver. This is happening all over the country. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, everywhere, and still playing out, and interesting to see where it will all end at some point. And I guess we're at the end of us for today anyway. I want to thank you both, Derek Carson from the Bennington Banner and also writes for the Manchester Journal, Howard Weiss-Tisman, who is the reporter for of Southern Vermont and the Upper Valley for Vermont Public Radio. Great to have you both with us today, and thank you again for making the time available. And thank you to you as well for watching us today. Hope you'll be back the next time. We'll see you again later.